Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome. My name is Michelle Lobkowicz. I'm from the University of Alberta Press, and we are just waiting for our room to fill up here for our panel, which is entitled Raise Up and Indigenous Voices in Canada. So if you'd like, drop into the chat a little bit about where you're calling from, or dialing in from, I guess, sorry. And we'll just wait a few more minutes for all attendees to join us. Oops. This is exciting. People coming from Florida, Saskatoon, balmy Guelph. There's lots of snow on the ground here in Edmonton, so, but I hear this beautiful weather in Ontario. So we'll just wait a few more minutes. Wonderful to see everyone coming from coast to coast and our neighbors to the south. Welcome everybody. So I think we'll get started. We have a full discussion planned, and I'm gonna kick it off since it's now time to start. So hello and welcome to Raise Up and Indigenous Voices in Canada. This event is part of University Press Week, and the theme this year is Raise Up, one that seeks to showcase the role that university presses play in elevating authors, subjects, and whole disciplines to readers across North America and around the world. This panel features authors and editors from 4 Canadian university presses who will share insights on how university presses engage with Indigenous voices and provide support so that Indigenous communities can tell their stories. My name is Michelle Lobkowicz, and I'm an acquisitions editor at University of Alberta Press, coming to you from my home in Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory. The University of Alberta Press acknowledges that it is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. While we are all coming together today in a virtual way, we all live on lands that are the home and traditional territories to many First Nations. We acknowledge them and their role as first storytellers. So the format for this session will be 4 press conversation presentations of around 10 minutes apiece, and that will be followed by a brief Q&A session. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. It's kind of in the middle of the Zoom screen. And I will also do my best to monitor the chat in case questions appear there, but it's helpful if the questions go into the Q&A so we don't lose them. I'd like to thank Jane Kelly and Ariel Gordon in particular for helping pull together this event. I'm very honored to be moderating for you today. And now I am pleased to introduce our first conversation group, Dr. Nancy J. Turner, Dr. Richard Atleo, and Kyla Madden. Nancy J. Turner is Distinguished Professor Emeritus and past Hakai Professor in Ethnoecology in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. She is the editor of Plants, People, and Places, the role of ethnobotany and ethnoecology in Indigenous peoples' land rights in Canada and beyond. Richard Atleo is Hereditary Chief of the Ahousaht First Nation and Adjunct Associate Professor in Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. He is one of the contributors to Plants, People, and Places and a major advisor in developing the symposium from which this book was developed. And finally, Kyla Madden is Senior Editor at McGill Queen's University Press. So I invite you all to turn on your cameras now. And Kyla, to start off, can you say a bit more about how you and Nancy came to work on this book project together? Do we have Kyla?
I actually haven't seen Kyla come on yet.
Well, Nancy, how about we talk to you about how this project came into being?
Kyla had told me the first question that she was going to ask was exactly about that and how we came to connect with this book. I first want to acknowledge that I'm here on the territory of the Snuneymuxw Coast Salish peoples on Protection Island. And it's been my pleasure to learn from and work with Dr. Richard Atleo for many, many years. Kyla was going to ask how we managed, how we connected originally. And it goes back a long time to the early 90s when I was asked to serve on the scientific panel for sustainable forest practices in Clayoquot Sound. And Richard Atleo, as a Nuu-chah-nulth chief knowledge holder, was asked to serve as co-chair on the panel, along with 3 other Nuu-chah-nulth members and about 16 or 17 scientists. And immediately I started learning a great deal from from Dr. Atleo. He was a wonderful co-chair who worked with all of us and taught us so much in a very kind way, full of respect. And we ended up doing reports together, and we've been friends ever since. We've worked together in a number of projects. And so when I came to working on the project that the book is an outcome from, the Plants, People, and Places book, it was through the Pierre-Elliott Trudeau Foundation that I was able to organize a symposium on plants, people, and places and the role of ethnobotany. And the first thing that I did when I decided to organize this was to go and talk to Richard. And he, right away, I think he really made a huge difference to both the symposium and the book that eventually was a product of the symposium. He told me, first off, among other things, make sure that the plants are involved. The plants are a part of this. The plant people, they are living beings, and they're what this symposium is about. So we had plants present at the symposium. And not only that, but Richard ensured that I introduced the plants to the symposium participants. And they've been a major part of this whole project. He also suggested that we have not just talking people, but talking conversation circles, that we get out on the land and visit the First Nations in the vicinity and hear from local people. All of those things were elements in the symposium, and they all ended up in some ways to contribute to the book. There's Kyla.
Hi to you both. I had a perfect storm of technical difficulties. I'm so sorry to leave you to start. Nancy, how are you?
Just great, Kyla. It's good to see you.
It's so nice to see you, Dr. Atleo. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm so sorry it's in this awkward way the first time. It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. So you've explained how you met each other?
Yes, I told about the Clayoquot scientific panel work and how that has led to our friendship over a long time. But Richard hasn't said anything yet.
Oh, please. All right. Let me not interrupt. Richard, please go ahead.
What am I to do?
Well, maybe you could tell us just about your experience of your meeting with Nancy, perhaps.
Yes, on the scientific panel, which was struck in 1993, the premier of the province was having a meeting with his cabinet in Port Alberni during the same time the tribal council was having a meeting. And so the head of the tribal council came, and at the same time we're having an education meeting at the local high school there. And the tribal council leader came over and asked me if I would consider sitting on the scientific panel, because they were negotiating at the time with the premier to have representation on the scientific panel. And so that's how I came to be a part of the panel. And during its sitting, met with Nancy and many other wonderful scientists on that panel.
Okay.
And so, yes, it was, from my perspective, not not at all a congenial beginning to the scientific panel, because at the first meeting, I immediately spoke out and said, why should we expect anything different than has happened to us in the past, where our roads came together during colonization and there was misunderstanding and misrepresentation on both sides. I said, why should it be any different now? And one of the scientists who became a very close friend of mine was completely outraged at my statement, for which I was very happy. And because there's a truth to it. When the University of Manitoba, to which I was attached, claimed to have worked with First Nations people since the last century, very unkindly, I told them that that's not true. And they took that, okay, yes, it is not true. And so while they like to work with Indigenous peoples and romanticize the working with from their perspective, we need to point out that, yeah, you need to be more realistic, right? And own up to the fact that you blew it left, right, center, right from the time Columbus thought he'd landed in the Orient. And so Nancy has been a very a wonderful mediator, a wonderful a person to work with to come up with a book that we will be launching shortly. And it's an example, the book is an example of multiple scholars working together in the face of a long history of not working together. And to show that with a lot of hard work, a lot of persistence, a lot of endurance, a lot of struggle, that it's possible to do that. And yes, there were difficulties along the way. And yes, that's just typical of human beings. And so, Nancy, good job. And you people in the academy, the press, yeah, good job for allowing this to happen.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful comments, Dr. Atleo, and for that last point. And we had some questions I was going to put to both of you, but I think you have each touched on some of that already. So maybe I will just put our last question to you in the time we have. And I can also show the book. I don't know if you have the book that Nancy has edited, that Dr. Atleo was instrumental in arranging the symposium. There it is. That the book is based on, is called Plants Plants, People, and Places, the roles of ethnobotany and ethnoecology, Indigenous peoples' land rights in Canada and beyond, with over 40 contributors representing many academic disciplines and professional sectors and Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts. It truly is a book that I think only a university press might publish, but because of the deep the collaborative work, the years of work, long before it becomes a book that comes to the press, it is one that you have been working on, each of you, in different ways. Can I ask as the last question, what do you see as the role that university presses in Canada can play in elevating Indigenous voices and perspectives, what we should be looking to do and working towards?
Richard, you go ahead and respond first to that if you like.
No, Nancy, you respond first. Alphonse,
Okay.
after you.
Okay. Well, I think you're right, Kyla. I can't imagine another press other than a university press, such as McGill Queen's, taking on a book like that and giving it a lot of coverage. I think a smaller press, might have been able to publish it, but it would not be widely disseminated or widely used, which I think that's the obvious goal of this book, is to provide information for as many people as possible in Canada and around the world about this important relationship that Indigenous peoples have had with plants for so long, and how various academics can help to promote the importance of that knowledge. So I'm grateful to McGill Queen's for taking that on.
We're grateful
Okay,
to you.
Richard.
I'd like to address this question from a more of a metaphysical or philosophical orientation, in that based in the ancient belief systems, we have a word called Ahousaht, which translated inadequately as respect in the English language. And the reason that it's inadequate within the English language is that respect is used within the English language in a limited way. Within the ancient Lewchuk way, respect was firmly nested in the notion of sacredness. That is, all forms of life, trees, plants, and animals, were accorded respect, were accorded as having value, not based on evaluation by others, but an intrinsic form of value. And of course, the nestedness of respect in plants, animals, and human beings is also further nested in Qua'uts, who is the owner of all existence, or the creator in the English language. And so attached to this sacredness is the purpose of creation. So there's a purpose to the university presses that is ascribed to the university presses. And the purpose is independent of the opinions of beings. That is, like the respect for trees and for fishes and for human beings and plants. It's an intrinsic form of existence. Hard to say in English. English is not very useful sometimes in explaining the meaning of the way of life of ancient peoples like Lewchuk. So as a Lewchuk person who was born into that ancient way, into that language, then I firmly believe that the university presses, as they came into being with a purpose. Nothing came into being without purpose. And in general, then, everyone who lives within the university press environment have an individual application of that general purpose. And how you use it, therefore, is a choice for each individual, and always. And so there are things that are numak. There are things that should not be done. but are done anyway, right? Because we have the choice to do it. So historically, in the recent past, there was a disagreement in my own work with the press I was working with, right? And so that work was shelved. From my perspective, it was right on both sides, in the sense that on the press's side, they had their reasons for rejecting my work. And on my side, I had my reason for presenting it, right? And so you have a clash then of worldviews, a clash of systems. And so I don't complain about it. It's the way it is. We have a phrase for that too in our culture, kwasisa-ish, and you can't always understand why things are the way they are, and that's where I come from. And I think that's probably true too in other areas of life. So there it is. You have a good purpose, but you also have the opportunity to be bad, right? In the way you express yourself.
It is. We have responsibility.
Yes, that's
Yes.
what I'm trying to say, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and thank you so much. That is, honestly, you dignify our work and make me want to do it better. And I'm very grateful to you, Nancy. It's been a professional highlight for me to know you.
Without Nancy Turner, you wouldn't have me here today. That would be true. She would be the catalyst for my being here.
Yes.
Thank you, Richard.
So people have a role.
Yes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I feel we might be at the end of our time, but I'm not sure. Oh, thank you. Hi, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kyla, Dr. Turner, and Dr. Atleo.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
So we're done then.
Done for now, yes, but we'll hold on till the end of the session and see if there's any questions that come up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
So next we have Dr. Jarvis Brownlie and Dr. Brittany Luby. Jarvis Brownlie is Professor of History at the University of Manitoba and is the series editor for University of Manitoba Press's Critical Studies in Native History series. Brittany Luby is an award-winning historian at the University of Guelph in Ontario. She is the author of Damned, The Politics of Loss and Survival in Anishinaabe Territory. Brittany and Jarvis would like to focus this portion of today's discussion on the colonial nature of research. And okay, you're there, great. So Jarvis, to start off, can you say a bit more about recent changes in the Canadian publishing industry and the influx of Indigenous voices in print?
Yes, sure, thank you. So Brittany and I had a phone call and so discussed how we wanted to proceed. So we thought I would give just a brief little sketch of the history of this series and then focus some questions on Brittany's amazing new book and her experiences trying to get it published. So just quickly, you know, university presses have been really important in making space for Indigenous voices, and it's been a process. When I first decided that as a settler I needed to understand the history of colonization, I expected to just go out and find all the books that Indigenous people had written about that and read them. And it was 1990, and there really weren't any. There were some old ones in the past. But so this series, for which I'm series editor, has a history going back to Gerald Friesen, also a settler scholar, but he worked with a lot of students on Indigenous history. And he set up the series originally to allow his graduate students to publish their work. So it was intended to make space for, well, originally just Indigenous history, or what was then called Native history, but it was mostly settler scholars. But we've now seen a shift. It happens to coincide with the shift from Gerald to me as series editor, but I don't take credit for that. It's a shift in the whole discipline, and really, Jill McConkey is the one who's done most of the work and is a fantastic editor. She's the one who lands most of the books for this series and works with people. But that's where this series came from, and it has now shifted so that all the recent books have been Indigenous scholars, and I'm very excited about that. So we thought that after that we would talk about a few issues that Brittany and I identified, which included the Western Knowledge Project in general, and those cultural differences between, in the ways that Western thought handles knowledge and approaches knowledge compared to Indigenous societies and their ways of approaching knowledge, and then also research too, and then the practices of academic publishing, including the peer review process, and issues around copyright. So Brittany, why don't you take it away?
Oh, thank you so much, Jarvis. I just want to say that I love plants, peoples, and places. So Nancy and Richard, thank you so much for bringing this book into the world with all the phenomenal contributors in it. It's just an absolute pleasure to read. So now to dive in and reflect on some of the knowledge issues that Jarvis and I wanted to share today. In Western knowledge systems, information can be thought of as a thing, right? Information can be acquired, it can be copyrighted, it can be owned. With the Anishinaabe teachings that I was raised with, however, knowledge, oh, thanks, Jarvis, knowledge is relational. And so as an Indigenous author, I don't have the sole right to share, these histories, these stories without active consultation. So I have a responsibility and a duty to discuss what information I share, how I share it. Are there regulations or responsibilities around that sharing? Is it secular knowledge? Is there ceremony that's required? Are there restrictions around when it's shared? Is it a story that has a seasonal use? And I just want to actually read a passage out of DAM from pages 13 and 14 that highlights this challenge as it appeared in my own work. So here we go. Despite many hours spent conversing with elders, I have limited the amount of their testimony quoted in these pages. This decision reflects community fears that Canada and Ontario could appropriate elders' knowledge, using it against the Anishinaabe during negotiations about land misuse or in court. Anishinaabe elders recognize, as anti-oppressive researchers Karen Potts and Leslie Brown have theorized, that, quote, knowledge can be oppressive in how it is utilized, end quote. BAM members at Dawes 38C Indian Reserve fear that government researchers lack the environmental knowledge to contextualize elder testimony. Researchers employed by Canada and Ontario might not have lived along the Winnipeg River. As a result, they might not be able to envision the river system and thus to enliven elder testimony. Without developing an Anishinaabe environmental framework for analysis, government researchers risk misreading interviews with elders. And it was these fears in my research practice and in my relationships that led me to limit quite heavily the amount of elder testimony that was quoted in Damned. I cited less than 1/3 of the interviews that I conducted. But this also created a really unique opportunity for me to think creatively about how to publish our story, my community's history. And what I ended up doing was turning to my elders as guides and using those interviews for, searching them for names and places, and then going into archives and seeking publicly accessible documents about those peoples and about those sites that we could then quote without the risk of having our elders' voices, read out of context, right? Someone could go back, pull my document, and read it sort of within the written record. And Jarvis, just to lead into that peer review piece that we wanted to reflect on, I'll say this and then invite you to share your thoughts. But I think it's during the peer review process in academic publishing that we as Indigenous scholars may face pressure to use certain documents or insert more of a certain type of voice. And at that point, you know, we really need to connect, you know, with our relations, and also get really comfortable thinking about and learning how to navigate our moral compass, because all of a sudden, you know, the peer review process might create pressures that compromise our relationships. And so I think we really need to know where we stand so that we can navigate those choices in a good way.
Yes, thank you. And I mean, I think everyone is aware that the peer review process is kind of a model with many strengths.
Absolutely.
You know, that can be extremely helpful. And I personally have my experiences have run the gamut from extremely helpful to and really improving a piece to extremely unhelpful. But as far as Indigenous research is concerned, in particular, there is a risk, you know, especially at this particular moment, as more Indigenous scholars, you know, become involved in academe. Thank goodness, I've waited a long time for this. They are being peer reviewed by more senior people, and that can sometimes mean that they're being peer reviewed by people who don't necessarily fully understand or share Indigenous research paradigms, and who may in fact undermine them, right? And insist on certain kinds of canons and texts that are non-Indigenous. And it's also a hierarchical process, especially depending how it's applied. It doesn't actually have to be hierarchical. And I know myself at AUPresses that when we've had peer reviews where we felt the review was problematic as opposed to the manuscript, we have acted accordingly, right? And that there's a process of negotiation. And again, Jill McConkey is very good at this, at you know, keeping perspective, right, and being reasonable, and also just keeping in mind what the author is trying to accomplish, right, which isn't always what the peer reviewer thinks they should be trying to accomplish. So, and I know, Brittany, that in some ways the peer review process did sometimes feel like it could be a bit of a derail for you.
Yes, absolutely. There were moments in the peer review process where I felt that there was a desire for me to cite more of the Western canon, and I really wanted to make sure that I was citing as many Indigenous authors as possible. But in saying that, I was incredibly fortunate to have two very thoughtful peer reviewers, one of which who knew the colonial laws better than I did and recommended I read a few, which was incredibly helpful. And then I had another peer reviewer who was actually recommending Indigenous voices that originated from Treaty Number 3 that my elders hadn't spoken to me about, that I was able to incorporate. But when you were speaking about peer review, Jarvis, the one thing that you mentioned was, you know, this idea of dialogue and conversation. And I think that's when peer review can work wonders, right? When you can talk through it with your editor. And I think one thing that, you know, I don't know how many Indigenous scholars are in the audience, but KAUT did a review fairly recently, and Indigenous peoples make up, I think it's like 1.5% of the, you know, of all professors in Canada. And so when you're looking to have these complex conversations, you know, you may not have people who look like you or know the cultural challenges you might be facing. And so, you know, we're trailblazers, and just because we don't know who to ask whether or not things are okay doesn't mean that we should be afraid of having the conversation. Because when you look at the numbers, you can feel powerless, but really we've all been gifted with a voice, right? So.
Yes, thank you. I think that the one other thing that we wanted to discuss briefly was copyright.
Yeah.
So, Brittany, I was wondering if you had mentors who'd given you any advice around copyright, and if, especially for possible junior scholars listening, what questions might you encourage them to ask around this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So copyright refers to the legal right of the owner of intellectual property to reproduce, you know, that property. And I think one of the greatest ironies about copyright in academic publishing is that at this very moment that we're increasing the number of Indigenous voices in print, we're decreasing Indigenous ownership over the intellectual material. And that has to do with some of the norms in academic publishing. It's not common for academics to keep their copyright. And it's not because there's not other options out there. If you haven't heard the word exclusive use yet, and you're thinking about publishing, please, you know, do some research, Google online, look up that phrase, exclusive use. And, you know, talking about my mentors, Jarvis, I didn't really have any direct mentors at the start, but when I was working on my footnotes and I had to find all that, you know, the publication information, I started paying attention to the little copyright sign. And I saw that the University of Manitoba Press, like Kim Anderson's book here, Kim and Renee kept their copyright. I love this book that was published with the University of Minnesota Press, Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask. This author, Mary, kept her copyright. Right, I'm going to pull out one more here, and then I'll roll back in. Michigan State University Press, Victoria Lepeau and Benjamin Lepeau, writing about Indian country, kept their copyright. And so I'm like, okay, you know what? There is a model here. There are Indigenous scholars, and I can see this when I'm doing my footnotes, that are advocating and protecting their intellectual property. And so I started asking questions about it with acquisitions editors, and just really asking for conversation. And so I think some of the starting questions to ask, right, if you see that contract and you're being asked to sign away your copyright, why? Right? Why do you need copyright? What do you intend to do with it? You know, are there other options that we can explore? If I sign away my copyright, what will you give me, right? How are you going to care for this text? How are you going to love this text? And I think you really need to ask yourself, right? So this is outside of those conversations. So ask the tough questions, open up that conversation, and then take that information and go, you know, do I want to risk losing the right to my story and my family story for the supposed privilege of having it in print? And it is a privilege, but you know, there's a cost benefit analysis you have to live with there. And I think for Indigenous academics in the academy, you know, you may feel pressure to, you know, run towards that tenure, right? And one of the foundations for getting tenure, at least in my field of history, is this published book. And as much as I want to be a tenured professor, and as incredibly fortunate and thrilled that I am to have a book in print, another question I think we need to ask ourselves once we have the information is, what sort of ancestor do we want to be, right? Who do we want to be for the future? So do I want to sign my copyright away today so I can get that book out tomorrow, so I can get the tenure, you know, in the next X number of years? Or do I want to be the academic who took it slow, researched my presses, and made it possible for the next generation to pick up books like these ones and say, you know what, there's people out there who made this conversation possible. I can have it too. Thank you.
I haven't really watched the time, but I think we've probably used up ours.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you both so much. I mean, we could have a separate session on each of the questions that you asked each other, I think. So lots of valuable information and things to contemplate. So thank you very much. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A tab down below. Okay, now we will hear from Miigam'agan and Jodi Lewchuk. Miigam'agan is a Mi'kmaq woman of the Fish Clan from Eskinopadish Burnt Church Reserve on the northeast coast of New Brunswick, Canada. Currently, she is elder in residence at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and she is a contributing author to The Gatherings, Reimagining Indigenous Settler Relations, which I believe is forthcoming next year. Jodi Lewchuk is an acquisitions editor at University of Toronto Press, working in the areas of anthropology, geography, Indigenous studies, sociology, and urban studies. So Jodi, to start off, can you say a little bit more about this book project and about how you and Miigam'agan came to work with one another?
Sure, I'll first say hello from here in Toronto. I'm just making sure my video is working. And of course, University of Toronto Press, which is on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of Credit River. And today, this place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to live and work on this land. So my first contact with Miigam'agan was when I received the proposal actually for the gatherings from Shirley Hager, who is one of the other members of the MQUP collective, and Shirley's been shepherding the project through development and the publishing process. And in that proposal, and of course now in the book itself, which yes, is coming out in spring 2021, there's an epigraph from Miigam'agan, and I thought I would share it with you. And so the epigraph is this. There is a word in Mi'kmaq, in piece 2. We might say in English, forgiveness, but it means we return to the original place and let's try again. So that was my introduction to the perspective and the elder wisdom that Miigam'agan brings to the gatherings, which is a book that we'll publish on our trade imprint, our new AVO imprint at UTP, with the intent to reach as wide a readership as possible with this story. And that story is the multi-year process a group of Wabanaki and non-Indigenous participants undertook together on the east coast of the US and Canada in order to heal their shared community and forge a new path of understanding together as a way to address and bridge the really deep and wide historical divide there has been between Indigenous and settler communities. And I think the really special thing about the gatherings is that they weren't legislated. They weren't the result of policy initiative. The gatherings were born of a desire between people to find a new way together and to find a new way to be together. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Miigam'agan via video, where she will speak about her experience of the gatherings process over those years and why she and the collective feel it's so important to share with the world this blueprint, really, for community reconciliation. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Oh, apparently my screen sharing is disabled. So Ariel, I'm not sure if you can play the video.
Greetings, everyone. I'll just turn the video on. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. I'm gonna turn it back. I'm gonna turn it on.
Hello, Majuahan. Mi weran bandere muya kiskuk. Uchitna. Wegulali gandeli bimani mi judan and gisku skudam and gistel maulugudiek. Uchit miewika digadikduk. Miigam'agan delusi. Ahwogamahna jaget. Atleo iskan waberich. Miigam'agan. Greetings, everyone, in my mother tongue. I want to express gratitude for the life, that's been given to all of us. And I want to also thank you for inviting us to come together and to share our collective vision through the book called Gathering. My name is Miigam'agan from Escanaba Village, and my clan is Lobster. And I'm really grateful for the life that has been given to me from the homeland of Wabanaki. So today I wanted to also share how important this experience has been for many of us in the Indigenous community and in the non-Indigenous community, our settler relations. And it's important to also remember us coming together was the land that brought us together. The work that started to begin to build relations with the environment, with the land, by our settler relations. And so the invitation of the people of the land, and this is how we were called upon to share our relationship to the land, to the settlers. And so from that, all the dynamics of our own was brought in the gatherings, which eventually turned into circles of how our ancestors gathered around historically in our councils, talking circles, sharing circles. And so from there, the relationship began to grow from that, because as well, for me, it was a level of comfort, something I was familiar with. So for me, the uniqueness of this experience was Indigenous led, and so, and how well received it was by our settler friends. And so the discussions that formed from that became real. So I welcome people to read the book to see how unique and how it was pretty authentic. It was difficult, but it's what relationships are about. So thank you so much. I look forward to hearing some feedback and how things move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. So the talking circle that Miigam'agan, describes is presented in the book as well. So each member of the gatherings has their own section of the book, and they talk about their experience going through the process. And the trade format's given us, some nice leeway in sort of presenting this material in a way that perhaps we couldn't have had the book had to go, through a really strict, academic process. So again, we're thrilled to be bringing it out on the trade imprint, hoping to reach, as many people as possible, again, with that idea that they might be inspired, to reach out and start to build these bridges in their own communities.
Thank you very much, Jodi. Looking forward to this project. Okay, our last grouping today, this afternoon, is Dr. Deanna Rader, Dr. Daniel Heath Justice, and Siobhan McMenemy. Deanna Rader is an associate professor in the departments of First Nation Studies and English at Simon Fraser University. She serves as editor for the Indigenous Studies series at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and was one of the founding members of the Indigenous Literary Studies Association. Daniel Heath Justice is Professor of Critical Indigenous Studies and English at the University of British Columbia, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literature and Expressive Culture. Siobhan McMenemy is Senior Editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. She has worked in scholarly publishing for over 20 years, during which time she has built book lists and edited scholarship in both the social sciences and the humanities. So Siobhan, to start off things, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Indigenous Studies series at your press and about your working relationship with Deanna and Daniel?
Yes, thanks, Michelle. And before I launch into that introduction of the series, I just want to duly recognize that Laurier and the WLUP are on the traditional territories of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The origin of our Indigenous Studies series reaches back into press history and to a period in the evolution of scholarly disciplines that predate the crucial centering of Indigenous research and methods and the writing and editing of Indigenous scholars. And we heard Jarvis mentioning this scholarly shift earlier in the panel. In 2008, Cree Métis scholar Deanna Rader was invited by the press to reimagine that series and recreate it into one that would be overseen by Indigenous scholars with an Indigenous-led editorial board. The series would be community-driven, collaborative in its editorial work, and Deanna, who is a committed activist and engaged in extensive community work, became the series editor at that point. Among the editorial board members is Cherokee scholar, writer, and activist Daniel Heath Justice, who's also with us today. Since 2008, Deanna and her colleagues have encouraged and seen through the publication process with us over 20 books, including 3 co-edited volumes from Deanna, who is currently working on 2 new manuscripts for us. And I just want to wave one of her edited volumes in front of the camera briefly. This is Read, Listen, Tell. And Daniel has published an award-winning book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, with us. I'm going to put it in front of me. And he's currently working with me on the development of a new podcast series as well. The Indigenous Studies series reaches across disciplines, which was crucial to everyone involved in the creating and establishment and subsequent development of the series. And to date includes work from Indigenous scholars in literary studies, urban studies, music and performance studies, education studies, film and cultural studies, history and communication studies. The series is currently in the midst of an editorial transition, and that is what I would like to pass the mic over to Deanna and Daniel to discuss and to tell us a little more about their plans and vision for the series into the future. Over to you two.
Thanks, Siobhan. I'll start with just a little bit more of that history, because I want to point out that I only finished my PhD in 2007. And that in as much as it's important for presses and a necessity for presses to be publishing Indigenous scholars and working with Indigenous scholars, you need to have Indigenous series editors. Chances are, given the pool, they're going to be junior. And that I've been really grateful for the kind of mentorship that Lisa Quinn gave me as I was navigating this, and now working with Siobhan. It's really, you know, the whole, really, and I think all of you know the way that whole systems work. We can't just have one Indigenous copy editor or one Indigenous series editor or one, you know, we really need to infuse the whole system. And that's how you build a discipline. So, I mean, I think about the kinds of work that we've done and been very grateful for the authors that we've been able to publish. But I mean, a lot of that, you know, the anthologies that we've published, like also Learn, Teach, Challenge, has been like one of the first anthologies of Indigenous literary criticism in Canada that even exists. You know, there are a couple of others, other places started some things, but it's that through that you can then come to a moment where you have a monograph by an Indigenous CRC, who that is now, by the way, I was recently on a jury for Native American scholars of Native American history and literature, and I think, you know, you're quoted so many times. It's such an influential book that I mean I look at that point and I see the arc that it takes. You know, you can't really have a thriving field unless you build the house. You know, so we're building the house, and we want a good place to live, and that's why there's a lot of sense to looking at this. I would have said 10 years. 2008 sounds very far away, but I would have said 10 years, where it's really time to pass the baton on to somebody with a new vision. And so that's of course a long process. And that's where really, I'm proud to say that I was the one who invited Daniel to bring this book to the series. And I think it makes so much sense for me lots to look to you for leadership, in the next stage. So over to you, Daniel. Thank you,
Wadul. Calling in from Seashell territory here on Canada's claimed coast, West Coast. And one of the reasons I really want to kind of center that is, I'm here not too far away from Deanna, but we can't see each other because of the pandemic and different circumstances. But one of the things that it really excites me about the work that's happening in the press, but also, the work in the field more generally, is there's a lot of attention to the specificity of place, to the nuances of history and relationships, and the complexities of those relationships, but also the fact that a lot of these things have been building for generations. And nothing that we do, if we want it to last, is going to ignore that history or ignore the really important sacrifices and commitments. Just like in Seychelles territory, Seychelles people have been protecting these lands and waters since time immemorial. Well, in Indigenous studies, we have generations of scholars, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who've been nurturing so many of us. And the work that Deanna has done to help ground the work with the press and Siobhan's ongoing support, I think for me, the vision forward is also one that takes real care with what we have been given, and that builds on those foundations in really careful, thoughtful, but also generative ways. So I think for me, the vision is one that is looking forward as well as attending to where we've come from. And I take really seriously Deanna's point about the issue of starting as an editor, as a junior scholar. That's also there's a lot of vulnerability in doing that, and lots of support from the press, but also I think senior scholars in the field being quite supportive, some of whom who aren't with us anymore, but really encouraging that care and concern. And Deanna and Siobhan and I have talked about this series going forward as one that's not just about kind of any individual's vision. It never has been, and Deanna has always been very collaborative and community minded, but also thinking about, okay, well, I might be stepping into the editorial role, but who's going to follow me? So also thinking about the editorship as a mentorship, and to think, okay, who are the really amazing emerging Indigenous scholars out there who could step into this role, but who may at this point not necessarily be in a position of being able to do so comfortably or even necessarily safely, because we're still in a time of backlash. And it's not always easy or good for junior scholars to step into roles like these. So how can we guide them from the very beginning as potential series editors, or whether or not series editors for this particular press, but maybe for other presses. So really thinking about the editorship as a mentorship, as well as a custodianship and a guardianship in the field more generally. Do you have anything else you want to say on that, Deanna?
I feel like I get really curious to talk to people who are here. So I think, do we have time for a question period? Or I think we've got lots more we can talk about. But I feel as though what is the sense of the room, what people are interested in talking about next?
Absolutely. Do we have any questions from anyone listening? Editorship as mentorship. I've taken lots of notes. There's so many tangents that we can discuss. I guess just to bring it back to the theme of this week, as part of University Press Week, which is kind of about the advantage or the possibilities of working specifically with a university press. For those authors who are on this panel, who have worked with both university presses and perhaps more of a trade press or a different kind of press. What do you see as advantages of working with this particular publishing community?
I mean, I'm thinking about what Brittany had to say, and really to a certain extent, certainly for Indigenous scholars, right, who are employed in the university and pre-tenure or even as building careers. This is really the go-to place. I mean, and so by all means, we have colleagues that publish outside the university press community, but there's so much support, that's built in, and so it's a natural,
Well, I think for me too, in Indigenous literary studies, it was university presses and the small independent presses who really stepped up first and made space and encouraged and supported and helped to nurture a lot of our writers, both in Canada and the US. It wasn't the trade presses who did that work. It was, or the larger houses, but it was the small ones who put a lot on the line. And I think for me, I really think we need to honor that legacy and that history and that ongoing relationship, because it's still the small presses and it's still the university presses who do the biggest work to support us and our scholarship and our creative work in these spaces. And I really appreciate that.
I'm not sure, Daniel, this is a good moment for you to talk about the podcasting project, but I think that of course opens up a new realm and something you're already planning.
Well, I think Indigenous scholars have always been multidisciplinary. I mean, I can't think of very many of us who aren't kind of connected in different ways, like with rhizomatic links to other disciplines. And so, traditional books are one really important way to get information out there, but there are also new ways. And Wilfrid Laurier University Press has been doing some really interesting peer-reviewed podcasts as a way of getting more of that scholarship out there to audiences who may also be reading the books, but who may want a different way of engaging with scholarly work and allow scholars to communicate in different ways with a broader public. So I think we've always been very creative and very adventurous. The genres haven't always kept up with the content. So I'm really excited that we have this opportunity at Wilfrid Laurier University Press to try something new, and we'll see how it goes. I'm late getting my outline to Siobhan, so that is also one of the joys. We get to know folks, and they hold us to account, and they hold us up while holding us to account. So I appreciate that too.
We do have one, sorry about that. Okay, we do have one question that came up in the Q&A, which is about the process of peer review. And this is open to all panelists, but if anyone wants to speak about the process of peer review and how you see it changing or particularly needing to change to support Indigenous work and Indigenous publishing in the future.
I feel as though it's hard to see our colleagues nodding, so maybe we want to have more panelists put their face up, otherwise we'll just answer. But I mean, it's a big problem if you're trying, and I think it's exactly what Jarvis and Brittany were talking about, that you can't, you have books that you want to have adjudicated by scholars in the field, and so for Indigenous literary studies, for example, a CanLit scholar is not the same, right? And so it's just an ongoing issue that really forces us to grow our field in order to be able to do the work we want to do. Yeah.
Well, and peer review implies that we have more peers, right? And so we really, it's also about that direction, from students who are first coming in, encouraging Indigenous students, in high school, in grade school, coming up, and making universities better places for Indigenous students and scholars so that they feel encouraged and they proceed through, but also not imagining that our peers are only those who have academic credentials, but also that we have peers all over the place and we're learning from a lot of people. I see Brittany nodding, so I'll shut up.
You too.
That was an affirmative nod. I think sort of, in terms of changing peer review or opening up peer review, recognizing that there's individuals who are capable of providing a peer review who may be outside of the system, right? When we're dealing with Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous teachings, and just what Deanna was saying earlier about infusing the system. I think that's one of the opportunities we have in the future, is making sure that there's more Indigenous scholars at different kind of levels of the system, so that we have the peers that our work can be going out to. So yeah, just a big affirmation on this end.
I don't know if we can keep going, but one question that came through via Siobhan earlier on was about, I guess about a quote from Greg Younging, the late publisher and author of Elements of Indigenous Style, who wrote about the need to indigenize writing, editing, and publishing. And we as publishers have a responsibility to learn from work like Greg's. But I was wondering if anyone on the panel has any other initiatives that they would like to tell us about, or that they would like to highlight are important for university presses to know about, perhaps as a concluding thing.
I just wanted to jump in because partly out of an initiative that Greg was part of in 2017, the Indigenous Editors Circle, he writes that some of the foundational understandings of and the need for establishment of an Indigenous Editors Association. And in fact, that has just recently been established. I'm the pretend past president, because we're working it in the 3 years. Jeanette Armstrong is the current president, and Megan Sinclair is the current president-elect. This has just been established in February, and it's I think indigenouseditorsAssociation.org. And right now it's the NUPIAT copy editor and other editor, Rachel Taylor, who's been really helping us lead these initiatives as we can fundraise. So you keep your ear open for it, because we need, rooms full of Indigenous editors, cohorts, so that you can draw on them and they can come lead your presses and therefore make the work of scholars, like Brittany and those of us better, more sensitive to the kinds of concerns we have. That's it.
This has to do, Deanna, I think, with it infusing the system, but I'd really love to see, a full life cycle, approach to Indigenous research. So, starting with research ethics boards. So, again, understand the purpose, very well intentioned, very essential, right, to doing careful research, well thought out research. But, can we get community representation there? What does an expert look like in that space? So that we're starting, from the very foundation, building up in a good way, all the way through to that editorial process. And then, afterwards, where are we returning our books? What does that process of return look like? Where are things being archived? Where are they being stored? So I think we're having this beautiful conversation about this critical point in the life cycle, but I'd love to see kind of indigenization on either ends of this moment as well.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have to wrap it up and leave it there. So many things to think about. I want to thank so much all of the authors and presses who participated in today's fantastic event. Again, McGill Queen's University Press, University of Manitoba Press, University of Toronto Press, and Wilfrid Laurier University Press. I think Ariel was putting links to all the books that were spoken about today into the chat. If you do not want to purchase these directly from the press's individual websites, we here urge you to support your favorite independent bookseller. Booksellers do a lot to support local community, local writers and publishers, and specifically the university press community as well. I would also like to thank Jane Kelly from University of Toronto Press for her energy in getting this AUPresses panel organized. And also, again, Ariel Gordon from University of Manitoba Press for her technical support in pulling this event together. And final shout out to you, the audience, for supporting the University Press community today and for celebrating Indigenous writers and Indigenous ways of knowing with us today. So thank you for sharing this special time with us. And everyone, please be well.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Michelle.
so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.